Chapter 2. Practices and Principles. What does it mean to do comparative literature? If you have taken the time to pick up this book, you are presumably interested in reading as widely as possible. You may not yet be familiar, however, with all the ways in which this interest can be deepened through scrutiny and reflection. The newcomer to comparative literature could certainly be forgiven for feeling disoriented by the sheer volume of competing schools. Indeed, it sometimes feels as though that is all there is: methods, approaches, theories. To be a comparatist is to struggle, at times, to peel back the layers of a crude reflection on precisely what it is to be a comparatist. Yet there are a number of basic strategies for comparing literature, strategies that have continually recurred while developing with the discipline, and it is with such first principles that an introduction to the subject may best begin. Before considering the history and theory of comparative literature, we must first and most fundamentally consider the practice. From the early 19th century to the early 21st, doing comparative literature has meant doing something that is ultimately impossible, namely mediating in an unprejudiced way between competing traditions, with full mastery of these traditions. If there is an implicit moral injunction inherent in comparative literature, read more widely, learn more languages, it is an injunction that no one, in the final analysis, can live up to. In the words of Samuel Beckett, we can only fail better. The question is, how to fail best? Should we understand comparative literature as a kind of elite discipline, a champions league for those who have already conquered at least one individual linguistic tradition? This was Goethe's view. Only the proven connoisseur should compare, he claimed. The amateur should consider every achievement individually. Or should comparison begin even as we are still first encountering the individual languages and cultures in question? This is the view implicitly taken by most undergraduate courses in comparative literature. Should comparison come at the end, in other words, or at the beginning? It is far from clear what it even means to read comparatively. There are as many reasons to compare forms of literature as there are to interpret it. Some critics compare for conservative reasons, defending European culture, for instance. Others for progressive ones, advocating international solidarity for minority groups. Some critics prioritize textual, others prefer contextual modes of comparison. One person's literary comparatist is another person's cultural freedom fighter. With regard to the technique of comparative literature, however, we can identify a number of basic principles, considered in the comparative spirit as conceptual pairs, as constitutive of its disciplinary practice. Such categories of comparison underlie much of the work that is undertaken in the field. Clarity on their advantages and on their limits is thus crucial for anyone wishing to understand the discipline. Topics versus methods. Perhaps the most basic question for the aspiring comparatist concerns the way in which to construct a comparative argument. Is it the texts or the approach to the texts that determines the precise nature of a comparison? Comparing forms of writing can mean tracing variations in a particular theme across a range of contexts, but it can also mean comparing the ways in which one traces them. Comparative literature can be pursued, in short, through its topics or its methods. Motifs and myths. One of the most widespread forms of comparative literature investigates the recurrence of key images or stories across a range of languages. Understood as a kind of recurring leitmotif or myth, these figures offer a ready-made structure for comparison. Examples might include the imagery of earthquakes in the Enlightenment, or depictions of the wandering Jew in 19th century literature. Such figures serve as helpful hooks for broader reflections on cultural memory and tradition, assuming, that is, that one asks not just what is being depicted and how, but also why. In our first example, the Lisbon earthquake of 1755 and the consequent loss of faith in God. In the second, paranoia about Jewish conspiracies behind international capitalism. Practiced in this fashion, comparative literature can offer a window into how periods and places think, as well as how they fit into the continuing conversation of cultural history. Arguably, the most common form of comparison involves identifying differing responses to a recurring question. This question may take the form of a motif or a myth, an issue or an idea, but it always presupposes a common topic that can be pursued across any number of variations. The most straightforward version of this topical approach is simply to compare, across languages, a shared idea in two books or two authors. The dangerous effects of too much reading in Don Quixote and Tristram Shandy, for instance, or the image of the labyrinth in the work of Jorge Luis Borges and James Joyce. But one can also take the approach further and compare three or more related texts, say the motif of adultery in Anna Karenina, The Scarlet Letter, and Madame Bovary, or even numerous texts by just one author, by Samuel Beckett, for instance, who wrote in two languages, or by the Portuguese poet Fernando Pessoa, 1888 to 1935, who wrote in three languages and under three main heteronyms. Alternatively, one might examine variant translations of a common source text, Shakespeare's sonnets, for example, or differing versions of the same story. J.M. Coetzee rewriting Defoe or Kafka, say, in the context of South African politics. As in chess, the number of moves in comparative literature is theoretically infinite. Except, of course, that in practice it is not. The reality of the discipline is that a relatively small number of authors, such as the major ones cited earlier, tend to be compared again and again. This is equally true for the second category of comparison, driven by questions of method. If the topic-driven approach to comparative literature is determined by the supposed internal coherence of the objects under discussion, such coherence can also be ascribed to the texts by the observer's choice of method. In this model, the critic identifies an argument, the enduring importance of Latin to European literature, for instance, or the marginalization of female authors in the 19th century, and prosecutes it from a particular perspective, feminist, Marxist, post-colonial, etc., assembling the evidence to reflect her ideology. The motif of adultery, to return to one of the examples cited earlier, can then be reconsidered from a feminist perspective. The point of comparison is no longer the topic itself so much as the methodological approach to the topic, which now becomes the determining factor. An obvious problem with this model, however, is that the method may also become a predetermining factor. Deciding on a feminist, or Marxist, or post-colonial approach means that the textual evidence may be slanted to reflect the approach, like a Rorschach test tells you what you already know. One can certainly compare Anna Karenina, The Scarlet Letter, and Madame Bovary as so many reflections of the oppression of women in the 19th century, but in doing so, one is also implicitly comparing any number of other considerations, the consequences of capitalism, for instance, or the use of grammatical structures such as free indirect speech. One method, in other words, implies another. As is often the case with comparative literature, the trick is not to know where to start comparing, but where to stop. Underlying both the topical and the methodological approaches to comparison is the question of validity. The classic Franco-German model of comparative literature, as elaborated in the 19th century, see Chapter 3, insisted on direct influence as a precondition for comparison. Without empirically identifiable proof, comparative claims were held to be invalid. This remains an important mode of comparison, but it has long since been supplemented by more supple forms of argument centered around what one might term, with Wittgenstein, family resemblances. Looking like each other can reveal as much as deriving from each other, and comparisons based on this principle about shared literary responses to the emergence of photography, for instance, or about the erotics of modernist style, have much to contribute. By making possible associative rather than merely additive arguments, these looser models of exchange have helped open up intercontinental comparisons. No longer must one text or author share another's direct frame of reference. No longer must influence be verifiable solely through archives and manuscripts. Ancient Chinese and modern French writers can mutually elucidate one another through their exploration of common philosophical concepts. The Greek father of history, Herodotus, can be compared across the centuries to Chinese and Arabic historians, such as Sima and Ibn Khaldun. Having license to compare literatures beyond what can be empirically proven means that more wide-ranging conceptual claims about the global circulation of issues and ideas become possible. The risks of such an approach, vagueness, overdetermination, are obvious. The potential benefits immense. Crucially, they depend on reconsidering the methods as well as the topics of comparative literature. Periods versus regions. Beyond the choice of topic or method, a great deal of comparative work, probably the majority, breaks down into two basic approaches: the historical and the geographical. Where the former looks longitudinally across time, the latter looks latitudinally across cultures. To compare these two categories of comparison is to consider the very basis of the discipline, torn between the literatures of the past and the languages of the present. If the richest work in practice constitutes a mixture of the two, it is because comparative literature looks both backwards and sideways. Like much of the humanities in the post-theory era, see Chapter 4, comparative literature has rediscovered its zest for the past. Historicize is among the more common pieces of advice given to aspiring comparatists, the subtext of which is often also contextualize. To compare occurrences of a particular topic in different literary periods, the idea of walking in Romanticism and modernism, say, or responses to trauma after World War II and the Indian Partition, requires sensitivity not only to the relevant texts, but also to the changing contexts. There is truth in Benedetto Croce's complaint that comparative literature is essentially literary history, but only if one's sense of this history, like Walt Whitman's sense of himself, contains multitudes. Another way of saying this is that the historical approach to comparison necessarily contains a geographical element, inasmuch as it implies a number of differing contexts within a particular period. Staying within just one culture would lend credence to Croce's reduction of comparison to literary history, since it is the kind of approach that can be practiced perfectly well within single-language traditions. To examine comparatively the idea of walking in Romanticism, to return to the example cited earlier, is to range across any number of European literatures, from Rousseau to Wordsworth, from Goethe to Leopardi. It is not, at least in the disciplinary sense of the term, to compare Wordsworth to Coleridge. Obvious though this may seem, refining a sense of what comparative literature is not can be as helpful as defining what it is. There is a tendency at times for the discipline to serve as a catch-all for any approach to literature, indeed to culture, that does not immediately fit into existing disciplinary structures, as though the very term comparative implied that anything goes. Perhaps the limits of its purview would be clearer if it were called comparative literatures, since the plural highlights the plurality of the discipline, its insistence on synthesizing at least two senses, or practices or traditions, of literature. Thinking historically across periods is one way of foregrounding this plurality. That said, the idea of periodization is far from uncontested. Although it has long been a prerequisite of university literature departments, from early modern to postmodern, both appointments and courses are largely determined by period. The intellectual basis for such distinctions is far less solid than the institutional. Where does one draw the lines between periods, for one thing, and how does one arbitrate between overlapping categories such as post-romantic and Victorian? How can one be sure that one is not retrospectively projecting a later sense of a certain period, which is to say, the accumulation of all the clichés about it back onto it, thereby merely perpetuating a myth rather than challenging it? If fame for the German poet Rainer Maria Rilke is the sum of the misunderstandings that surround a new name, then so, arguably, is the idea of periods. Comparative literature can help with these misunderstandings, paradoxically by adding to them. The notion of a period may correspond more to its aggregate of past and present rhetorical constructions than to any objective fact. Precisely for this reason, however, the more rhetorical constructions are identified and compared and contrasted, the more complete the picture of the period will be. One way of combating what the literary theorist Franco Moretti calls the zeitgeist fallacy is to take the fallacy seriously as a manifestation of any number of national and international factors that offer insight on their own terms as contextual evidence into a period's self-understanding. To do full justice to Romanticism as a periodic category, to take this section's principal example, one must de facto be a comparatist, since its major works in France and Italy do not appear until the 1820s and 1830s. A full generation after its first flowering in England and Germany, and so in part constitute responses to the English and German precedents. A related issue arises when one pursues periodization into an individual oeuvre. We speak casually of early or late Shakespeare, without pausing to reflect that these categories are themselves critical constructs. It was not until Edward Dowden's studies of the 1870s, for instance, that what we now consider the last plays, primarily the romances, The Tempest, The Winter's Tale, and Cymbeline, were established as a separate group. Dowden's view of Shakespeare's late style as grave and glad, serene and beautiful, is only one possible model of lateness, however. Equally plausible is the raging, rebarbative mode that Theodor Adorno identifies, to cite just one example, in the late works of Beethoven. A full appreciation of the category of late style, in other words, can only emerge through comparison of its many manifestations in differing forms of art and culture. Such an approach to periodization suggests the comparatists' ever broader horizons. Yet the pragmatic need for parameters has led, in recent decades, to an increasingly popular tendency to go the other way and zoom in on a specific year. On or about December 1910, human character changed, Virginia Woolf famously claimed. Teasing out the reasons for and manifestations of such a momentous change is a prime task for the comparatist. Such a perspective can yield fascinating results. Other years that have been approached in this fashion include 1913, 1922, and 1926. But it risks becoming blinkered as much as focused, restricting the critic to the artificial constraints of a calendar year. Some form of periodic division nonetheless remains indispensable, if only to regulate expectations. Literature's power to cultivate readers, writes Ted Underwood, in the most sustained recent consideration of Why Literary Periods Mattered, 2013, depends on vividly particularizing and differentiating vanished eras, contrasting them implicitly against the present as well as against each other. Comparative literature's power depends on setting these eras not only against each other, but also against alternative versions of each other, as they manifest themselves in differing national traditions. This is another way of saying, then, that what I have termed the geographical axis across regions and languages matters as much as the historical approach. Indeed, it arguably matters more, since it is possible to conceive a comparative approach that only looks across differing cultures, comparing Arabic, Indian, and European postmodernisms, for instance, without also considering their historical variations, while it is not really possible for comparative literature to be only historical, since this would fall within the remit of single-language traditions. Comparison, in other words, has to look across before it looks back. To be sure, the concept of a region is no less contested than that of a period. One of the great advantages of comparative literature, indeed, it is in many ways its mission statement, is that it can unsettle, through its broad intercultural approach, preconceptions about particular countries or areas. Places viewed comparatively become spaces. Transnational area studies of regions such as Latin America or India have shown that the history and literature of these continents are just as rich and just as comparable as those of Europe. Yet such studies also show that the myth of continents, to cite an influential title, continues to provide our meta-geographical categories. For the sake of rhetorical argument, comparatists find it necessary to essentialize regions as homogeneous cultural traditions, speaking of Europe, the West, the East, or Africa. Of course, we all have a rough and ready idea of what such categories denote, but comparatists are caught in the double bind of needing to use them in order to pick them apart. Europeanists or Orientalists thus have an ambivalent relationship to the regional terminology with which they work, since it is both geographically legitimate and culturally questionable. Claims to a particular tradition, in other words, are also claims to the right to criticize this tradition. It is obvious that such claims can only exist within specific political parameters. To take just the example of post-war Europe, the two major poles of West and East developed their own powers of attraction in ways that came to determine the major axes of comparison. In the West, the Franco-German dominance of comparative literature gave way over the course of the century to Anglo-American hegemony. That this reflects the broader reality of cultural and political power structures, not least the increasing ubiquity of global English, is, of course, not a coincidence. As Walter Cohen has shown in his magisterial History of European Literature, 2017, Western Europe has been a victim of its own success since at least the Renaissance, with regional assumptions about form and content, the triumph of the vernacular over Latin, the increasing dominance of narrative fiction, foregrounding local preferences at the expense of global alternatives. To practice comparative literature in this context is to risk a colonial cringe in reverse. In Eastern Europe, meanwhile, comparative literature was increasingly centralized around the USSR. Such a policy of centralization, with as many texts as possible translated into Russian, but almost none between the more minor languages, such as Bulgarian or Polish, was all the more striking in a region that is inherently comparative. Multilingual Mitteleuropa, as scholars such as Karel Emerson and Galen Tianov have shown, produced many of the leading theories of literary comparison. Slavic culture, to cite another of the many transnational terms associated with the region, has always been a cradle of comparison, dominated by Russia but drawn to the Western prestige of France and Germany. That the fertile meta-capacities of the Central European mind should have been harnessed to a single state-sponsored agenda suggests the extent to which comparative literature is at the mercy of absolute power. Beyond East and West, this regional consideration of comparative literature within Europe could equally be extended to North and South. In the former, the Nordic model of comparison understands Scandinavia as a continent unto itself, which means that much of its history has been devoted to comparing Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian literatures among themselves. In the latter, the Greco-Roman legacy has meant that the Mediterranean has long been viewed as the center of the world. Modern historians, such as Fernand Braudel, who drafted his monumental study of the Mediterranean and the Mediterranean world in the age of Philip II, 1949, while he was a prisoner of war in Germany, have merely reinforced this perception. Whatever point of the compass one follows, then the overall point is clear. One regional category, Europe, the West, conceals another, Central Europe, Scandinavia. Comparatists, in short, spend their lives simultaneously constructing categories and taking them apart. If the richest comparative work mobilizes both history and geography, periods and regions, it is in full cognizance of this ambivalence. Close versus distant reading. How, though, does such ambivalence play itself out? How does comparative literature both construct and deconstruct its critical categories? The traditional basis of the discipline is the interpretation and juxtaposition of more than one literature in its original language. Having acquired the necessary linguistic skills and having decided on her topic, a decision that is subject inevitably to changing fashions and power structures, the comparatist sets out to cross-refer any number of mutually enlightening texts, generally within some form of common framework, a period, a region, a motif, etc. With slow philological rigor, she combs through one text for echoes of another. Syntax, structure, argument, idiom, all these and more may offer up cues for comparison. Culturally curious and textually promiscuous, she is on the lookout for ways in which one work echoes, complements, or contradicts another, extending its effect beyond its ostensible confines. Similarity is good, but difference is better, inasmuch as it may point up some hitherto unsuspected aspects of the texts in question. Attention to detail, above all, offers a way of opening up broader arguments about time, manner, and place. All of this is a way of saying that the traditional basis of comparative literature is close reading. Close reading. Associated with the practical criticism that helped establish English literature as a discipline in the 1920s, and with the subsequent new criticism of the American 1940s, close reading focuses on syntax, sentence structure, semantic ambiguity, and imagery, as well as on the contextual resonance of specific words. Comparative close reading applies such techniques to more than one work from more than one tradition, examining the ways in which the microanalysis of textual detail can open up the macroanalysis of contextual significance. One might, for example, examine World War I through the prism of the national literatures that responded to it. Close reading in this context could involve comparing, say, poems by Rupert Brooke, Auguste Stram, and Guillaume Apollinaire. Brooke's sonnet, The Soldier, foregrounds Englishness, mentioned no less than 6 times in 14 lines, as his salient quality. Even in death there should be some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. Given such sentiments, comparison with foreign literature seems especially important. Yet Brooke's very traditional sonnet structure contrasts violently with the expressionist scream of Stram's poetry. A poem of this title begins with neologisms and distorted syntax. Days in coffining, worlds cemeterying, Tage Sargen, Weltengraben, before proceeding through a series of one-word lines to conclude with the nihilistic crescendo of pains, 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 paining, not all. Wir, wir, wehen, nicht all. Such poetry can only be read closely as an onomatopoeic response to the horror of the trenches. Apollinaire's Cotton in Your Ears finally takes this a step further, recreating an explosion of artillery shells typographically, with the words of the poem shattering up the page. Syntax, in short, enacts sentiment. Such is the wager of close reading. While this approach can obviously also be taken to texts within a single language, it is only by comparing texts across several languages that a composite sense of differing responses to the war, sentimental in England, nihilistic in Germany, shattered in France, can be properly achieved. Such a close philological approach to literature remained more or less uncontested through much of the 19th and 20th centuries, deriving, as it ultimately did, from the prestige of biblical exegesis. In the beginning was the Word. Shortly thereafter came its interpretation. Authority, by definition, accrued to the author. The critic deferred to the text. The most orthodox models of comparison are intimately tied to this question of authority, cleaving closely to an original, and permitting comparison only where direct influence can be affirmed. There is no more urgent task today for those who choose to account for the European literary movement than to research as exactly as possible what the international relationships have been throughout the centuries. The French comparatist Joseph Text's clarion call of 1898 exemplifies the then dominant Franco-German model of philological source hunting as the proper preoccupation of comparative literature. We are a long way from this today. Theoretical, technological, and not least cultural changes have profoundly altered the way we read. The theory wars of the 1970s and 1980s eroded authorial authority. See Chapter 4. Even if Roland Barthes' claim for the death of the author was overstated, there was no doubt that the critic, by making the meaning of texts contingent on the master theorist, was angling for primary status. Technological developments, meanwhile, have made it possible to compare vast numbers of texts through keyword searches and Internet databases. And there is no doubt that the post-war disappearance of deference, of class-based, unquestioning acceptance of authority, has changed the way we read. We are all authors now. For comparative literature, these changes have led to the emergence of the idea of distant reading. Coined by Franco Moretti in 2000, the term was originally meant to describe the inevitability of leaning on second-hand reports when dealing with a multinational corpus of world literature. Pursued without a single direct textual reading, the power of such an approach was to be directly proportional to the distance from the text. Rapidly, however, it morphed into a broader catch-all term for the digital, data-driven approach to literature. One determined more by graphs, maps, and trees, to cite the title of Moretti's book of 2005, than by words, ideas, and texts. The established model of close reading gave way to an evolutionary model of distant reading that could trace, for instance, the rise of the novel in Britain, Japan, Italy, Spain, and Nigeria. Big data produced big patterns. Metaphors of the rise and fall of the novel became materially visible. From the point of view of comparative literature, Moretti's model has much to commend it. For one thing, it obviates the whole problem of translation. No more need one cringe at not working with the original texts. In an era of ever-expanding conceptions of world literature, this is no little advantage. It also foregrounds as honestly as possible the critic's inevitable distance, geographical, cultural, linguistic, from so many of the texts that she studies. Closeness is no longer the comparison devoutly to be wished for. Perhaps most importantly of all, distant reading makes possible and legitimizes large-scale studies of literature that would have been impossible in a previous age, certainly by any single scholar. Seen from a distance, literary fortunes and fashions come into renewed focus. One has only to consider the rise of the term comparative literature from 1800 to 2000. Which can be graphed via Google Books. However incomplete the Google corpus of books inevitably is, someone has to choose and classify them in the first place. This kind of graph offers a vivid and, importantly, verifiable sense of the rise of comparative literature as a discipline. Moretti has compared these tools to the invention of the telescope, and one can understand why. Such graphs can be used to explore any number of comparative combinations, offering a long-distance lens through which to view changing trends and patterns. Even allowing for statistical variations and distortions, this is information worth having. Why then do so many critics have a nagging feeling that something risks being lost in the transition from close to distant reading? The answer lies, perhaps, not so much in the specifics of distant reading as in what it represents. To say that distant reading makes close attention to textual detail redundant is too easy. If anything, computer searches and databases help facilitate studies of specific words and idioms. Proficiency in the interpretation of statistics and data is becoming an increasingly important skill for comparatists. There is no reason to think that celebrated close readers such as William Empson or Leo Spitzer, were they alive today, would not avail themselves of all available technologies in their analysis of literary style. The real transition, then, is not so much from one model of reading to another, as from one model of what reading is for to another. Close reading analyzes the text as a work of art, invested with its own authority. Close comparative reading inquires as to the relationship between competing modes of authority. Distant reading, on the other hand, treats the text as the expression of broader literary and cultural trends, mapping it onto the evolution of forms, genres, and ideas. Close reading, in short, is aesthetic, where distant reading is ultimately sociological. Understood in these terms, it is no surprise that critics who are so heavily invested in the status of literature should seek to defend their closeness to it. Partly, of course, this is a defensive expression of their privileged role as gatekeepers and interpreters of literary tradition. It is also, however, a profession of belief in this tradition, where the closeness of the reading is proportional to the authority, not only artistic, but also moral, ascribed to the texts under discussion. In extreme circumstances, stylistic analysis of major works can be a way of reaffirming the value of a tradition, forming a comparatist's version of inner exile. Erich Auerbach's Mimesis, 1946, and Ernst Robert Curtius's European Literature and the Latin Middle Ages, 1948, written against the backdrop of World War II, provide perhaps the best-known examples of the phenomenon. See Chapter 3. Even in more normal circumstances, however, close reading implies intimacy not only with given texts, but also with the broader tradition and values of which these texts form a part. As such, it raises the crucial question of how comparatists understand and apply the very concept of tradition. Canon versus counter-canon. In 1919, the young T.S. Eliot opened an essay with the startling claim that, in English writing we seldom speak of tradition. It is only a slight exaggeration to say that a century later, comparative critics seldom speak of anything else. Eliot argued that the European tradition was not set in stone once and for all, and that the individual talent could even alter it retrospectively. The enduring influence of his own critical tastes, his preference for Dante over Milton, his championing of the metaphysical poets, provides a case in point. Whatever his personal choices, however, there is no doubt that Eliot's literary heroes, like those of the Western tradition more generally, were largely pale, male, and stale, and there is no doubt that tradition in the 21st century can no longer be conceived merely traditionally. Criticism of the Western tradition, of its biases and blind spots, has become one of the staple activities of comparative literature. Indeed, over the last few decades, this critical approach to ideas of tradition has arguably emerged as the discipline's raison d'être. Comparison has implicitly developed into compensation, into a way of redressing perceived literary and cultural injustices. To do comparative literature means to assert specific areas of global literature as worthy of attention. In this regard, the discipline resembles nothing so much as a battlefield, a no-man's land of claims and counterclaims. For feminists, there are not enough women writers in the tradition. For post-colonialists, not enough ethnic minorities. For translation scholars, not enough minor languages. For Marxists, not enough representations of social realities. The one thing on which all parties seem able to agree is that Western European middle-class men have taken up a disproportionate amount of space in the standard narratives of great literature. If history is written by the victors, literature has been underwritten by the oppressors. The term that has come to encapsulate these disputes is the canon. That this word derives from biblical rules or laws is not the least of its provocations to secular humanists of the 21st century. We no longer defer unthinkingly to religious modes of authority, so why should we defer to literary ones? As with religion, So with literature, the term has polarized protagonists into two opposing camps. Conservative critics such as Harold Bloom or George Steiner defend the authority of the canon against what Bloom terms the school of resentment. Progressive critics, for want of a better term, attack it as hopelessly complicit in political and cultural oppression. Politics replaces aesthetics as the principal arbiter of validity. Such quarrels, thankfully, are now mostly behind us. To practice comparative literature in the 21st century is to reap the benefits of these debates without being beholden to them. It is to work within an ever-expanding notion of the canon without feeling that one must constantly attack it. The canon certainly remains a key comparative battleground, but not in such a sterile, polarizing manner as in the closing decades of the 20th century. Instead, comparatists have been finding ways to reload the canon without firing it, to freshen up the bathwater without throwing out the baby. If comparative literature got us into this mess, one might say it is now doing its best to get us out of it. The principal mode that has emerged for doing so is the capacious concept of world literature, the great advantage of which is that it extends the canon without losing too much energy contesting it. World literature, at least in its 21st century incarnations, simply repositions the Western tradition as part of a global whole, no more nor less important than any other area. To be sure, questions of canon occur not only in Europe and America. Areas such as India and the Maghreb have their own traditions, and concomitant squabbles over them. Yet there is no doubt that the Western vision of the canon has vastly expanded over the last 20 years, as reflected in anthologies of world literature that now routinely include work from all corners of the globe, and by all creators great and small. Comparative literature, in a very real sense, has won. Our quarrels now seem ended. Yet we should be wary of crying victory too quickly. For one thing, aesthetic criteria will always remain subjective, whether from the point of view of individuals or from that of cultures. If a Chinese writer rises to worldwide prominence, is this because she is acclaimed by Chinese critics, or by international, which in practice usually means English language, critics? Institutions, such as the Nobel Prize Committee, have an important role to play in canonizing international authors, particularly those who write in less prominent languages, but their decisions will always be partial, not to say political. Even those writers whose success arises through international rather than national reception, Susan Sontag's championing of the German writer W.G. Sebold's literary greatness comes to mind as a recent example, arguably tell us more about one culture's preconceptions of another than anything else. To succeed internationally, and thus to be read, by extension, comparatively, it helps to correspond to the prevailing international image of your country, preferably in some critical, dissenting manner. The problem, following this logic, is that the study of world literature, however one practices it, does not automatically imply a world perspective. Assessments of aesthetic quality will always be required, and they will always presuppose a given set of values. The canon may be modified by the introduction of the new, the really new, work of art, but who is to say what that work is? It is a truism that no cultural judgment is completely free of ideological baggage, and it will always remain true of the literary canon no matter how it is conceived, whether on a European, world or planetary scale. See Chapter 4. With the Danish critic Mads Rosendahl Thomsen's notion of canonical constellations, itself a useful term for understanding the gravitational pull of literary force fields, The imagery even goes interplanetary, but it still implies an observer looking through a telescope from a given point on the Earth. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the canon, as it is currently discussed within comparative literature, then, is its sheer inflation. David Damrosch's terms for what he identifies as the three forms of the canon: hypercanon, the major authors; countercanon, the previously marginalized subaltern authors; and shadow canon, the minor authors now pushed to the margins, suggest the extent to which canonical theorization has proliferated in comparative literary studies. Indeed, in many ways, what characterizes the discipline now is not so much a theory of the canon as a canon of theory. For certain followers, theoretical statements about comparison have assumed the authority of dogma. For all its anarchist energy, contemporary comparative literature seems to be in danger of replacing one canon with another. Arguably more interesting at this point, then, are the practical implications of the canon debate, the way it predetermines critical choices. Contemporary practice suggests that there is a risk of comparative literature emerging as a zero-sum game, whereby one author's critical gain is another's reputational loss. After all, there are only so many hours in the day. There are only so many books that can be read in a lifetime. Some version of a canon is a practical necessity, if only for working purposes. Interestingly, the real danger would seem to be not to great white males, such as Shakespeare or Joyce, but to the smaller fry traditionally described as minor authors. As Damrosch has shown in an example of distant reading at one remove, statistical analysis of scholarly publications suggests that the major authors of the canon only stand to gain from being associated with comparative methodologies. Transnational readings of Heart of Darkness or post-colonial readings of The Tempest are all too common. It is the lesser figures that have been squeezed out by the theoretical boom, since few careers are made on the back of comparative readings of minor poets. The irony, in other words, is that the assertion of one form of minority risks pushing out another. Yet the implications of canon theory for doing comparative literature remain underexplored, not least in terms of establishing why one should choose to read comparatively in the first place. What does it mean for a Western critic to read an emerging African or Asian writer within an international rather than a national context? What does one gain from studying an established author such as Flaubert within a comparative canon of other international realists, as opposed to within the French tradition? However sensitive one is to the political prejudices behind the canon, there is always the risk of flattening out local differences by imposing universal perceptions. The scale, in short, requires careful calibration. One size does not fit all. It is far from clear, then, that there is a single correct strategy for constructing a comparative perspective on the canon. Should one concentrate, to take the examples just cited, on the great works of European realism, or rather explore a counter-canon of lesser-known, possibly non-European texts? Should one accept the body of realist literature as it has been passed down to us, or question the very concepts of realism and literature? Arguably, it is only possible to construct a counter-canon after having first established a canon. But then this in turn would seem to give cultural priority to a predetermined tradition. There is, in short, no single answer to such questions, but posing them remains a crucial aspect of comparative literature, both in theory and in practice. Genres versus styles. If criticizing the canon involves assessing the merits of one text or author in the light of another, and is thus an inherently comparative exercise, one of the principal ways of doing this is to explore the construction of genres and styles. To consider a genre or a style comparatively is to alter, however subtly, our view of it, since differing languages have differing generic and stylistic conventions. For the student of comparative literature, genres and styles not only offer hooks on which to hang an argument, but they also function as a way into both formal and historical conceptions of what literature is for. Genre distinctions are as old as antiquity. The three traditional categories, drama, lyric, epic, are the earliest avatars of what would become, in the modern era, the principal literary genres as we know them today: plays, poems, novels. Within these categories, a further basic distinction has traditionally obtained between comedy and tragedy, operating as what one might term modes of expression. Should one use literature to laugh at the world, like Democritus, or to weep over it, like Heraclitus? Montaigne may have sided with the former, but the higher status has traditionally accrued to the latter. In the hierarchy of emotions, tears have always trumped laughter, just as suffering has trumped pleasure. Genre theory. From the point of view of comparative literature, the issue here is that such genre distinctions, whether or not they are truly universal, predetermine our aesthetic and affective responses. A significant body of thought has grown up around the idea of generic conventions. Understood as regulating a reader's expectations of a given text, such conventions can be confirmed, frustrated, or subverted. But for better or for worse, they structure all literary interaction. In reading fiction, for instance, we suspend disbelief. In reading autobiography, we expect truth, and are troubled when the pact is broken, as with fake memoirs of the Holocaust. The way that we interact with genres, often without even realizing it, relies on the comparative mechanisms of similarity and difference, since our expectations of a text are predetermined by our experiences of previous texts in the same genre. Both critical and commercial constructions of literature constantly locate themselves within such pre-existing genre distinctions, confirming or contorting them as the case may be. To say that one book is like another is thus to make a comparison based on categories of genre. To work within a given genre is to work with a whole set of precedents, prejudices, and presuppositions. One can neither write nor read a text without some knowledge of its conventions, even, perhaps especially, if the intention is to break these conventions. In the terms of the reception theorist Hans Robert Jauss, we read within a stylistic, thematic, conceptual, even typographical horizon of expectation, without which meaningful engagement with literature is barely possible. For the comparatist, defined by her broad horizons, this creates an intriguing quandary. To declare the death of tragedy, as George Steiner did in one of his earliest books, 1961, requires an extraordinarily wide range of reference, but it also requires regulating this range against its generic conventions, derived above all, in this case, from ancient Greece. Marina Warner's comparisons of fairy tales and enchanted stories from across Western and Eastern culture are only possible if the stories share certain stylistic or thematic similarities, such as frame narratives or wicked witches. Even Sir William Jones, 1746–94, one of the first to treat lyric as a universal category, could do so only by imposing European standards onto Persian poems, He even translated classical Arabic poetry into Latin. Genres can mean different things in different times and places. In other words, practicing comparative literature through the prism of a genre or mode amounts to a delicate balancing act, expanding the horizon of examples while constrained by the horizon of expectation. More prosaically, genre categories are often used as a means of limiting or focusing an area of inquiry in ways that may risk seeming arbitrary. If studies of naturalist drama or the romantic lyric have more than practical coherence, however, it is precisely because they bring with them specific formal and emotional associations. The Scandinavian inflections of Ibsen and Strindberg in the first example, or the Sturm und Drang of angry young men in the second. Comparatists can work against such associations by giving them greater intercultural nuance, but they must also work with them to stake out their area of study. Comparative literature needs cliché as much as it negates it. Stylistic conventions, meanwhile, can equally help or hinder the comparatist. Such conventions may operate at the level of periods, the romantic lyric, the realist novel, or at that of rhetoric, the recurrence of organic imagery, the use of free indirect speech. But they always refer to ways of writing more than to the content itself. As such, they offer a model of comparative literature based primarily on aesthetic rather than political grounds. This is not to say that stylistic choices cannot also be ideological choices. Dante's decision to write in the vernacular rather than in Latin, for instance, was nothing if not ideologically motivated. But their critical appreciation necessarily foregrounds the technical, aesthetic achievement. To understand why someone writes in a certain way, one first has to understand how he writes. The classic investigation of such stylistic choices remains Auerbach's mimesis, which traces modes of realism all the way from Homer to Virginia Woolf, by concentrating on differing levels of style. See Chapter 3, ranging across classical, medieval, and modern literature. Auerbach reveals how changes in style drive the development of European writing. Significantly, he criticizes writers who stick too closely to the idea that certain stories or milieus require a certain style, from the low register of comedy to the high register of tragedy. Auerbach's argument is rather for a mixture of styles. Both the humble and the sublime are necessary and valid responses to the human condition. Rhetoric must also be realistic. From classical reception to colonial mimicry, from medieval liturgy to modernist literature, close readings of style form the bedrock of comparative literature. Such readings imply a common generic framework within which to compare. As Sheldon Pollock notes of Sanskrit literature, modes of literariness conceived of as regional styles within a cosmopolitan space are a precondition of comparison. A given literary genre such as comedy or tragedy, that is to say, may contain any number of differing styles, such as high or low, courtly or vulgar, the comparison of which produces in turn thematic insights about social and cultural status, for instance. Above all, for style not to be merely style, and for comparison not to be merely comparison, but to produce an argument that is more than the sum of its parts, it requires an organic rather than an artificial relationship to that which it is describing. If textual meaning emerges from the shifting relationship between form and content, then so, in short, do the best comparisons. Writers versus readers. But who, finally, are the best comparatists? As a discipline, comparative literature has largely developed as the preserve of critics. As a practice, it is equally the privilege of authors. Comparison occurs not just after the event, in the mind of the reader, but also already during the process of composing a text in the mind of the writer. Comparative literature is as much creative practice as critical theory. Writers often anticipate and invite comparative approaches to their work. Eliot's notes to The Waste Land, 1922, form an obvious instance, such that the reader is forced into taking a broad, multilingual perspective. Or they build the structure of comparison into their premises. Montesquieu's Persian Letters, 1721, and Goethe's West Eastern Divan, 1819, to take just two examples, adopt a self-consciously Asian perspective in order to gain critical purchase on contemporary Europe, and even these two examples must in turn be compared and contrasted, since Montesquieu was only using the Persian persona to defamiliarize France, whereas Goethe was genuinely interested in Islamic culture on its own terms. Pushed to an extreme, then, the very notion of literature can be seen as inherently comparative, inasmuch as it contains, potentially, a dizzying infinity of times and places. Literature, in short, is also a site of comparison. Understood in this manner, doing comparative literature takes on a new meaning. In its most fundamental sense, it simply means to write, to place oneself within an existing framework of references and relationships. Partly this is a function of the fact that many writers are also critics. For Eliot, for instance, no poet has complete meaning alone. You must set him for contrast and comparison among the dead. Yet even within the creative process itself, comparison plays a major role in assigning meaning, since new words and ideas derive, inevitably, from old words and ideas. As Ezra Pound noted, all ages are contemporaneous, and this is especially true of literature. If literature is thus inherently comparative, it is because it acts as a compressor, blending past, present and future, and conflating numerous, often conflicting cultural perspectives. Of course it does not always do this to the same extent, and some styles and epochs seem to be more comparative than others. I have cited Eliot and Pound, for instance, as exemplars of modernism, now increasingly understood as global modernism, and certainly within the Anglo-American world the modernist manner was nothing if not obsessively intertextual, conceived as a way of foregrounding the internationalism of the post-war years. The exhausted European mind, ground down by the murderous attrition of the trenches, started looking further afield for inspiration. To India in the case of Eliot, to China in the case of Pound. Their poetry, with all its subsequent prestige and influence, is inconceivable without this intercontinental admixture. Yet such comparative techniques were hardly new. The very first modern novel, for example, playfully foregrounds, or feigns, its hybridity. Don Quixote, 1605-15, Cervantes claims, was translated from an Arabic version written by the historian Cide Hamet Benengeli. No such person existed, of course. The name means something like Sir Hamid the Aubergine Eater, but Cervantes uses him to insert the novel into contemporary debates about Spain's three cultures. The Jews having been expelled in 1492, the Moors followed in 1609-14, which is to say in the years between the two volumes of Don Quixote, leaving only Christians and New Christians, forcibly converted from Judaism and Islam. Cervantes' authorial sleight of hand, then, forces attention onto the multicultural, interfaith tradition of Spain in the Golden Age, positioning his novel against the national decrees. By implying a comparative text constructed across two languages, and by giving it a comic twist, Cervantes was effectively speaking spoof to power. It is no coincidence, then, that Jorge Luis Borges should have chosen Cervantes' masterpiece as the pretext, in both senses of the term, for his astonishing meditation on the nature of translation. The short story Pierre Maynard, author of The Quixote, 1939, is both satirical and salutary. Maynard's inspired idea is to translate Cervantes, word for word, from Spanish into Spanish. With a straight face, Borges notes how revelatory it is to compare Maynard's Don Quixote with that of Cervantes. When the latter, writing in the early 17th century, adduces truth, whose mother is history, Borges passes it as mere rhetorical praise of history. When the former, in the 20th century, proposes exactly the same sentence, the idea is hailed as astounding. Maynard thus becomes the author, not the translator, of Don Quixote. As a commentary on translation, on reception, and on the contextual bias of comparative literature, the Argentinian author's story of a fictional Frenchman rewriting the Spanish classic is a stroke of genius. It is also, however, itself a work of comparative literature, conflating critical vision with creative verve. Borges' story points to the increasing self-awareness that attends modern forms of comparison. Educated authors cannot but be aware of their modern or postmodern condition. To write in the contemporary era is to situate oneself within the history not only of literature, but also of comparative approaches to literature. Post-colonial writing provides important examples of this. Contemporary authors such as the Indian Amitav Ghosh or the Kenyan Ngugi wa Thiong'o write in full knowledge of the leading theories of their condition, trained as they are to see through the imperial legacy, so much so, indeed, that Ngugi now writes once again in his local language, Gikuyu. Just as much as writing in the 21st century is born digital, so some texts are born hybrid or born translated. Decolonizing the Mind, to cite the title of Ngugi's seminal study of 1986, is nothing if not a self-conscious process, comparing the minds of Europe and Africa, and not least of the many different peoples within Africa, is heavily theorized from the start. In considering comparative literature from the point of view of the writer, then, it may be useful to distinguish between differing degrees of self-consciousness. For there is an important difference between consciously encouraging the reader to compare and contrast the modernist, postmodernist, or post-colonial model, and unconsciously writing oneself into situations that can then be read comparatively. One might call this the realist model, but it also applies to broad swathes of literary history more generally. In the former, the writer invites the comparison. In the latter, it is the reader who imposes it, albeit onto receptive ground. Intertextuality may be the strongest mode of authorial comparison, but it is not the only one. All this is a way of saying that writers are also readers, first and foremost, of their own work. The more internationally minded among them, modernists, post-colonialists, are the most obviously comparative. But all writers work to compare and contrast themselves, implicitly or explicitly, with other forms of literature. The anxiety of influence, in Harold Bloom's famous phrase, is also the anxiety of comparison, the never-ending attempt to disambiguate one's own work from that of others, without whom one could not exist in the first place. Literature, whether consciously comparative or not, is a dance of similarity and difference, and it is writers, not readers, who set the tune. When considering the practices and principles of comparative literature, then we would do well to consider them from the perspective of both creators and critics. The increasing prominence of hybrid forms, such as adaptation and inter-art studies, where the emphasis is on the ways in which creation is inherently comparison, suggests, indeed, that this double perspective is emerging as a focal point for the discipline. Readers cannot compare without writers, and writers cannot compare without reading. On such first principles rest the many practices of comparative literature.